I want you to imagine just going about your normal everyday routine. You wake up, you grab your morning coffee, maybe you commute to work on a crowded train or, walk through a bustling city square.
Yeah, just living your life.
Exactly, just living your life. And as you breathe in the fog rolling off the bay or the breeze in a subway station, you are entirely unaware that you are currently the subject of a massive covert government experiment.
I mean, it sounds like a dystopian fiction setup, right? But this was the reality for millions of Americans.
It really was. And welcome to our deep dive into the source material covering Operation Sea Spray and really the wider United States biological weapons testing program of the mid-20th century.
It's quite a stack of historical records we have today.
Yeah, it is. Our mission today is to unpack these records and congressional hearings to understand what happened when the military secretly blanketed American cities with bacteria. We're going to examine the medical mysteries that followed and, explore that profound friction between national security imperatives and public safety.
Right. And to understand the origin of this program, we really have to look at the strategic blind spots of the United States in the year 1950.
Set the stage for us.
Well, the military had a firm grasp on nuclear capabilities, right?
Yeah.
And conventional warfare. But biological warfare was just this massive unknown.
A total black box.
Exactly. Intelligence suggested that adversary nations were developing pathogens capable of, wiping out entire metropolitan areas. And the tactical problem was that the U.S. had zero concrete data on how a biological weapon would actually disperse.
Because you can't just guess how it interacts with the unique topography and, the microclimates of an American city.
No, you can't. They needed a way to measure vulnerability. But mapping wind currents on paper just isn't enough to understand how a living organism travels.
So they decided the most effective way to test a city's defenses was to simulate an attack on their own soil.
Yeah, they needed a pathogen simulator, something that would mimic the physical dispersion and behavioral patterns of a deadly biological agent, but, without the lethality. So they selected biological agents they sincerely believed were harmless to humans, just to serve as stand-ins for weaponized diseases.
Okay, let's unpack this. I mean, the mechanics of how you actually execute a simulated attack on a major metropolis, because the logistics of Operation Sea Spray are just fascinating.
Oh, absolutely.
So this operation ran from September 20th to September 27th, 1950. The U.S. Navy positioned a ship just off the coast of San Francisco, California.
Right off the bay.
Yeah, and over the course of a week, they released these huge plumes of two specific types of bacteria into the heavy fog that, naturally rolls from the ocean into the bay.
Right. And the two bacteria chosen were Serratia marcescens and Bacillus globigii. And the military didn't just pick these randomly, by the way.
Well, they had a very specific reason, right?
Very specific. They were selected for physical properties that made them ideal for tracking. So Serratia marcescens, for instance, produces this very distinct bright red pigment when it grows at room temperature.
So it acts almost like a biological highlighter ink.
In a laboratory setting, yes, exactly. If you capture it on a petri dish, it forms these unmistakable red colonies, making it incredibly easy for scientists to distinguish it from the thousands of other natural microbes just floating in the ambient air.
Makes sense. And what about the other one?
Bacillus globigii, on the other hand, was chosen because it forms very hardy, durable spores. This allowed it to physically mimic the environmental resilience of anthrax.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, it survives UV light, temperature changes, wind shear, much like a weaponized agent would.
And the tracking mechanism here is what I really want to focus on, because they weren't just spraying and guessing where the wind took it.
Far from it. The military established 43 specialized monitoring stations all across San Francisco and the surrounding areas.
43 stations?
Yeah, 43. And these stations utilized air sampling devices that operated by actively pulling in large volumes of ambient air.
Just sucking it in.
Right. And then impinging the airborne particles onto sticky filter papers or agar plates. Those samples were then collected, taken to military laboratories, incubated, and counted.
Okay, I think the best analogy for this is to imagine releasing like a chemical tracer into a massive, heavily populated fish tank.
That's a great way to picture it.
Right. The tracer is invisible to the naked eye of the fish swimming around. But the researchers looking from the outside have specialized equipment. In this case, those 43 air samplers and the resulting red bacterial colonies.
Exactly.
And that allows them to see exactly how the water currents push that tracer into every single corner of the tank.
And, the data generated by those monitoring stations provided Pretty grim picture. By counting the bacterial colonies on those plates and extrapolating the volume of air sampled, the Army calculated that nearly every single one of San Francisco's 800,000 residents had inhaled at least 5,000 of these bacterial particles.
Wait, 5,000 particles each?
Yes,
And that specific number, 5,000 particles, that is critical to understand.
it really is. It is the widely accepted infective dose threshold for pulmonary anthrax.
Wow.
If a person inhales 5,000 spores of weaponized anthrax, the likelihood of a lethal infection is extremely high.
So by proving that the ambient wind currents could deliver that specific payload to 800,000 people simultaneously, the military considered the dispersal a massive tactical success, didn't they?
They did. It demonstrated a near-total vulnerability of the urban population to an offshore biological strike.
But this brings us to the fallout. Because the bacteria acting as our harmless chemical tracer might not have been as benign as the military believed.
Right, the timeline of what happened next is where the controversy really begins.
So the Navy concluded the spraying on September 27th. Just 2 weeks later, on October 11th, 1950, 11 patients checked into Stanford Hospital near San Francisco, and they presented with very rare, severe urinary tract infections.
Yeah, and the infections were so unusual that the attending doctors at Stanford meticulously documented the outbreak. They actually later published their findings in a prominent medical journal.
It was that rare.
Yes. And while 10 of those patients eventually recovered after intense treatment, one did not. Edward J. Nevin, a man who had been recovering from a recent prostate surgery at the hospital, developed severe infection that spread to his heart valves,
Oh, that's terrible.
and he died 3 weeks later.
And beyond Stanford, there were other epidemiological anomalies popping up too, like following the release of the Serratia marcescens, public health records showed a noted spike in pneumonia cases across San Francisco.
It did, yeah.
And decades later, medical researchers even began questioning whether this specific military experiment might be responsible for an uptick in heart valve infections seen around the Bay Area at the time.
Or even if the environmental seeding played a role in serious Serratia infections documented among intravenous drug users well into the 1960s and 1970s.
So what does this all mean? The Army consistently maintained that the outbreak at Stanford Hospital was purely coincidental to their offshore spraying, right?
That was their official stance, yes.
And I have to push back a bit on the implication that the Army was definitely responsible here. Because looking at the medical logic from the sources, the Army's defense holds serious weight.
It's a fair point to make.
Think about the scale. If the military blanketed a city of 800,000 people and everyone inhaled 5,000 particles, we should expect to see a massive citywide wave of illness.
Right, a huge spike everywhere.
But we didn't. The severe illnesses spiked in just one specific hospital. Furthermore, all 11 of those victims at Stanford developed these infections following invasive medical procedures.
Yes, that's a key detail.
That epidemiological pattern strongly points to a localized internal hospital contamination, like improperly sterilized catheters or surgical equipment, not an airborne pathogen blowing in from the bay.
Your analysis of the epidemiology is spot on there, and you are highlighting the exact argument that makes definitive blames so difficult to assign. A localized cluster among postoperative patients does typically indicate an internal vector.
Right.
The tension here, however, lies in the deliberate blinding of the public health apparatus. Because the operation was highly classified, the military never alerted local health authorities.
Ah. So the doctors were trying to solve a puzzle while the government was hiding the biggest piece.
Precisely. I mean, imagine being a diagnostician at Stanford in 1950. You were presented with a highly unusual bacterial outbreak. To determine the origin, to figure out if it was a contaminated catheter or an environmental exposure, you rely on environmental sampling and patient histories.
But the doctors didn't know the ambient air had just been flooded with billions of particles of that exact bacteria.
Exactly. Because the baseline data was kept secret, scientists were robbed of the opportunity to conduct rigorous, real-time epidemiological tracing.
Which means we'll never really know.
We lack the definitive proof to confirm the spray caused Edward J. Nevin's death. But the military secrecy ensure there is no definitive proof to completely exonerate the spray either.
That lack of information just buried the event for decades. Health officials and the public remained completely in the dark. It wasn't until nearly 30 years later, in 1977, that the truth was dragged into the public record.
Yes, during a series of hearings held by the U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Health and Scientific Research.
Right. And the Senate hearings forced the military to declassify the existence of Operation Sea Spray, finally revealing to the citizens of San Francisco what had happened in the air above their city in 1950.
And this revelation prompted action. In 1981, Edward J. Nevin's surviving family sued the federal government.
Yeah.
They filed a lawsuit alleging negligence, claiming the government was directly responsible for Nevin's death, and seeking damages for the profound emotional and financial harm inflicted on his widow.
But the legal battle that ensued illustrates the immense difficulty of prosecuting historical state secrets, doesn't it?
It really does. The lower court ultimately ruled against the Nevin family, and the ruling was predicated on the burden of proof.
Meaning they couldn't prove it.
Right. The family simply could not present definitive legal evidence that the specific strain of bacteria released by the Navy was the direct biological cause of the infection that killed Nevin.
And it makes sense when you think about the mechanics of the legal system. Suing the government in 1981 for a covert military test conducted in 1950 is like trying to sue the wind for knocking down a fence 3 decades prior.
That's a great analogy.
The original physical evidence is gone. You don't have tissue samples from 1950 to genetically match against the military's laboratory strain.
No, you don't.
The family fought hard, appealing the decision all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court declined to overturn the lower court's judgment.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this legal outcome represents a profound systemic conflict. It pits the individual rights of citizens against the broad, sweeping mandate of national security. When a government conducts operations in absolute secrecy to gather defensive intelligence and allows 30 years of history to pass before acknowledging those actions, the passage of time itself becomes an impenetrable shield against accountability.
It's just an almost insurmountable barrier for a civilian.
Exactly. The legal burden placed on a civilian to prove causation after decades of classified silence is incredibly high.
Well, here's where it gets really interesting. The 1977 Senate hearings didn't just expose Operation Sea Spray. They peeled back the layers on a massive nationwide testing program.
It wasn't an isolated event.
No, the San Francisco test was just one operation in an ongoing campaign.
And the scale of the program revealed during those hearings was staggering. The military disclosed that between 1949 and 1969, they conducted 239 separate open-air tests of biological agents across the country.
239.
Yeah. In 80 of those experiments, researchers deployed live bacteria that they believed to be benign. In the remaining tests, they utilized inert chemical compounds to study the physics of atmospheric transport.
They essentially turned the entire North American continent into a laboratory.
They did.
In the 1950s, Army researchers dispersed Serratia over Panama City and Key West, Florida, to study tropical and coastal dispersion. And the sources indicate there were no known illnesses resulting from those specific releases.
Right.
But they didn't just stick to bacteria. During that same decade, they ran tests over the American Midwest, blanketing areas like Minnesota with a chemical compound called zinc cadmium sulfide.
And the choice of zinc cadmium sulfide was entirely about visibility. It is a highly fluorescent compound under ultraviolet light.
So it glows.
Yes. By dispersing it from airplanes, military scientists could deploy specialized air sampling filters across vast distances, shine UV light on the captured samples, and literally count the glowing particles to track the atmospheric drift.
But the alarming part is that zinc cadmium sulfide is identified in the source material as a known cancer-causing agent.
If it is.
They aerosolized a known carcinogen over the Midwest to map wind currents.
And the data they gathered regarding those atmospheric currents revolutionized their understanding of continental drift. Researchers detected those fluorescent particles of zinc cadmium sulfide more than 1,000 miles away in New York State.
Over 1,000 miles.
Yeah. It proved that a biological or chemical payload released in the middle of the country could hitch a ride on high-altitude jet streams and effectively contaminate the eastern seaboard.
Wow. They also made heavy use of Bacillus globigii, the anthrax simulant we discussed earlier, which has never been shown to be harmful to humans. They released it in Washington, D.C., New York, and even along the Pennsylvania Turnpike.
Just to see how vehicular traffic on a highway system might agitate and spread a pathogen.
Right. But we have to look at the 1966 New York City subway operation because the mechanics of this test are incredibly cinematic.
Oh, the subway test is a masterclass in studying the fluid dynamics of enclosed infrastructure. Military researchers filled glass light bulbs with a bacterium called Bacillus subtilis variant Niger.
And they carried these light bulbs into the Midtown Manhattan subway stations, walked up to the edge of the platforms, and simply dropped them onto the track.
Just drop them. And dropping the bulbs on the tracks utilized the mechanical energy of the transit system itself. When a massive subway train pushes through a narrow, enclosed tunnel, it acts like a giant piston.
Okay.
It forces an enormous volume of air ahead of it and creates a powerful vacuum trailing behind it. When the arriving trains crush the glass bulbs, the impact aerosolized the bacteria.
And then the train just pushes it.
Exactly. The piston effect of the trains then pumped that invisible bacterial cloud through miles of subterranean tunnels, pushing it onto platforms and up ventilation shafts to the street level.
That is wild. The military analyzed the spread and compiled a report in January 1968, and the conclusion was a sobering wake-up call.
Very sobering.
They determined that a similar covert attack using a genuine pathogenic agent during peak commuter hours would expose massive numbers of people to infection, resulting in widespread illness or death.
What's fascinating here is, from a purely tactical standpoint, the intelligence gathered here was invaluable. By sacrificing a few light bulbs, the military mapped the vulnerabilities of the nation's critical transit arteries.
They proved how easily it could happen.
They proved that the enclosed, high-traffic environment of a subway system is the perfect distribution engine for a biological weapon, capable of exposing hundreds of thousands of people before health authorities even realize an attack has occurred.
Now, the subway test measured local exposure, but a test they ran in Washington, D.C. measured national spread.
Right, the Greyhound test.
Yeah. In May of 1965, researchers conducted a secret release of Bacillus globigii at Washington's National Airport and its Greyhound Line's bus terminal. Over 130 passengers were unknowingly exposed to the bacteria while waiting for their buses.
And then the military just let them board their route.
Just let them go. In the 2 weeks following the release, those exposed passengers traveled to 39 different cities across 7 states.
This was an epidemiological tracking exercise. Instead of relying on the wind or the mechanical piston of a train, they turned the civilian passengers into human vectors.
Wow.
They were gathering raw data on how a localized pathogen could transform into a complex interstate crisis in a matter of days, simply by riding the normal arteries of commercial travel.
I have to raise an ethical question here, though. I mean, measuring wind currents or testing a subway tunnel is one thing, but secretly exposing unknowing bus passengers and tracking their movement across 7 states feels fundamentally different.
It crosses the line for a lot of people.
Right. Gathering defensive data is crucial, but at what point does it cross the line into recklessly playing biological dominoes? If they had misjudged the bacteria, if it turned out to be harmful, like the debate surrounding the Stanford cases, they wouldn't just be dealing with a localized hospital outbreak. They would have actively seeded a pathogen across the entire country.
The scenario you are describing is the exact tactical paradox at the heart of the entire 239 test program.
Yeah.
The mandate of the military is to protect the nation from catastrophic existential threats.
Sure.
To engineer effective defenses, they require empirical, real-world data on how those threats behave in civilian environments. But by acquiring that data covertly, without consent, they place the very citizens they are sworn to protect directly into an unpredictable equation.
Yeah.
And the sources show this wasn't just an isolated American philosophy.
No, the records highlight a UK connection as well. From 1971 to 1975, a joint team of U.S. and UK military scientists conducted the DK trials. They sprayed a mixture across South Dorset in England,
Right.
and this mixture contained a bacterium, an anthrax simulant, and phenol.
And the inclusion of phenol is key to understanding the mechanics of these joint trials. Phenol is a chemical compound that alters the physical properties of the mixture.
What way?
Well, by combining it with the bacteria, scientists were able to simulate the exact environmental resilience, the chemical preservation, and the physical clumping properties of weaponized anthrax.
Oh, wow.
This allowed them to study how a highly engineered biological weapon would survive and travel across the British countryside without actually releasing a lethal agent.
So, synthesizing all of these sources, we see a vast, interconnected effort. From the foggy shores of San Francisco and the vast plains of the Midwest to the subterranean tunnels of New York City and the bus terminals of the capital, the American public acted as unwitting test subjects in a massive 20-year Cold War laboratory.
They did.
The military systematically prioritized the acquisition of defensive intelligence over the concept of public consent.
It really forces a profound recontextualization of our daily environments. knowing that the atmospheric jet streams, the air circulating in an airport terminal, and the breeze generated by a subway train were all systematically manipulated to simulate mass casualty events.
Yeah.
It just changes how you perceive the infrastructure you interact with every day.
It changes the entire lens through which you view a city. And I want to leave you with a final thought to consider as you digest this deep dive. All 239 of these covert biological tests, dropping glass light bulbs onto subway tracks, relying on analog air samplers, tracking physical bus passengers across state lines, these were executed in the analog era of the mid-20th century.
Decades ago.
Right. We now live in an era defined by invisible, seamless technology, hyper-connected global transit, and advanced atmospheric monitoring. Given how effortlessly those tests were conducted in the 1950s and 60s, how might a modern vulnerability test be happening around us right now?
That's a chilling thought.
And as you go about your routine tomorrow, would you ever even know?